Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting, the metabolic theory of cancer.
Oh, yeah. This one's been getting some buzz.
Yeah, lots of people wanted us to deep dive into this one, and, well, we found a whole stack of research papers and even a podcast interview with the main guy himself, Professor Thomas Seyfried.
Right, he's the one who's really pushing this theory, isn't he?
Yeah, and get this. Seyfried thinks almost everything we think we know about cancer is wrong.
So he's directly challenging the current understanding of cancer.
Oh, big time. He doesn't hold back.
Well, the dominant theory in cancer research right now is the somatic mutation theory, right?
Right, and that theory says what?
Well, it says that cancer starts because of random mutations in our DNA, our genes.
So like bad genes gone rogue kind of thing.
Exactly. But Seyfried says not so fast. He thinks cancer is actually a metabolic disease.
A metabolic disease. Huh. So what's his evidence?
Well, for one thing, he points to the fact that sometimes cancers are found and there are no mutations in the DNA.
Really, no mutations at all.
Nope. And sometimes those mutations that are supposed to be the big triggers for cancer, those, I think they call them driver mutations.
Right, driver mutation.
Yeah, those are sometimes found in totally healthy tissues that never become cancerous.
So if it's not just our genes going haywire, what's actually going on in those cells? What's the alternative explanation?
Well, that's where the mitochondria come in.
The mitochondria.
Yeah. Remember those? The powerhouses of the cell.
Right, vaguely, from like high school biology.
Yeah, so they're these tiny structures inside our cells, and they're responsible for making energy through a process called oxidative phosphorylation.
Oxidative.
It basically means they use oxygen to convert the nutrients from our food into energy that our cells can actually use.
So it's like they're the little engines that keep everything running smoothly.
Exactly.
But what happens when they go wrong?
That's when things get interesting, right?
Right.
So when the mitochondria get damaged and they can't do that oxidative phosphorylation as well, the cells have to switch to a different way to make energy. And that's called fermentation.
Fermentation, like making beer.
Haha, sort of.
Okay.
So yeah, it happens in our cells too sometimes.
I see.
It's like the backup energy system, you know?
Like when the power goes out and you have to switch to a generator?
Yeah, a generator, exactly.
I think that makes sense.
The problem is, though, that this whole fermentation process creates a lot of waste products, particularly lactic acid.
Lactic acid, like when your muscles are sore after a workout?
That's the one.
Okay.
And this might surprise you, but it also creates succinic acid.
Succinic acid.
Yeah, and that comes from glutamine.
Wait, glutamine. I thought that was something athletes took as a supplement?
Yeah.
What's that got to do with cancer?
Well, it turns out that cancer cells, with their damaged mitochondria, they rely on both glucose and glutamine for their energy.
So they're not just using sugar, they're using this glutamine too.
Yeah, it's like they've got this double fuel source.
I see.
And they ferment both of them.
Okay, I think I'm following. So we've got these damaged mitochondria. The cells have to switch to fermentation. They produce lactic acid and this succinic acid as byproducts. And cancer cells are especially good at using both glucose and glutamine for fuel.
That's it. And Seyfried thinks that all these waste products, this lactic acid in particular, it's like a smoke signal.
Like a smoke signal saying what?
Saying that something's wrong at the cellular level.
Interesting. A sign that the energy system's messed up, and that might be what sets the stage for cancer.
Right, and this isn't a totally new idea either.
Really?
Yeah, back in the 1900s, a scientist named Otto Warburg, he noticed that cancer cells, they ferment a lot, even when there's plenty of oxygen around.
So he saw this connection between cancer and fermentation way back then.
Yeah, they called it the Warburg effect. He even won a Nobel Prize for it. But for whatever reason, his work didn't really lead to any new treatments.
So maybe he was onto something, but it got kind of lost along the way.
That's what Seyfried thinks. He thinks there might be some confirmation bias going on.
What's confirmation bias again?
It's like, you know, when you're looking for evidence that just supports what you already believe.
Right, right.
So scientists, you know, they get focused on this idea of cancer as a genetic disease.
Yeah, and for decades, that's where all the research and funding has gone, right?
Exactly. It's hard to change course when you've built your whole career on a certain way of thinking.
And Seyfried has a great quote about this, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. He says, it's difficult to convince someone of something when their salary depends on them not being convinced.
Ouch. But yeah, I can see his point. So, okay, Seyfried says cancer is a metabolic disease.
A metabolic disease rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction.
Mitochondrial dysfunction. Can we unpack that a bit? What does that actually look like inside the cell?
Sure. So in a healthy cell, the mitochondria, they're humming along, making all that energy through oxidative phosphorylation.
Right, that efficient process we talked about.
Exactly. They're using oxygen to break down glucose and all that other stuff, creating ATP.
Which
The
is
ATP is like the energy currency of our cells.
okay, so it's a well-oiled machine. But when the mitochondria are damaged,
Things start to go wrong.
what happens?
The cell can't rely on that oxidative phosphorylation anymore. It has to switch to fermentation, which is like a much less efficient way to make energy.
And that's when the trouble starts, right?
Yeah, because it doesn't make as much ATP, that energy stuff, and it creates all those acidic waste products, the lactic acid we were talking about.
Right, and that lactic acid can damage the surrounding tissues.
Exactly. And it can create this environment that's actually favorable for cancer cells.
So it's like the cells running on fumes, creating all this pollution in the process. And the cancer cells, with their already messed up mitochondria, they actually thrive in this toxic environment.
It's like they're built for it, you know.
They can survive and actually grow in this messed up environment.
Right. They're using all that available glucose and glutamine to fuel their growth.
So, okay, I think we've laid the groundwork here. We've got dysfunctional mitochondria, a shift to fermentation, a buildup of these acidic waste products that cancer cells can actually use to their advantage.
Right. That's the basis of Seyfried's metabolic theory of cancer.
But, okay, big question. If cancer is a metabolic disease, how do we treat it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. Is there an alternative to chemo and radiation?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Seyfried thinks we can actually manage cancer by going after the fuel sources those cancer cells depend on, and he calls it the press pulse strategy.
Press pulse. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, imagine you're trying to put out a fire, right? You wouldn't just throw water on it randomly. You try to cut off the oxygen supply and target the hottest flames.
Okay, so how does that apply to cancer?
Well, the press part of the strategy, that's all about restricting glucose.
Okay, cutting off the oxygen supply to the fire.
Exactly. Essentially, you're starving the cancer cells of their primary fuel source. And the best way to do that, according to Seyfried, is through a ketogenic diet.
Right, we touched on that earlier. Super low carbs, high fat, force the body to burn ketones instead of glucose.
Right. And this is where the evolutionary perspective comes in, too.
Oh yeah, what's the evolutionary angle here?
Well, Seyfried argues that our modern diet, you know, all that processed food and sugar and unhealthy fats, it's nothing like what our ancestors ate. For most of human history, we were in a state of ketosis naturally. Our bodies were burning fat for fuel.
So it's not just some fad diet, it's actually going back to a way of eating that we're kind of designed for.
That's the idea. And this is where Seyfried gets really passionate. He talks about how, you know, our ancestors would have killed for a box of donuts, but those donuts would also probably give them type 2 diabetes.
It's true. We're constantly surrounded by foods that our bodies just weren't designed to handle.
It's like we're sabotaging our own metabolic health.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if we can shift back to a more natural way of eating, can we actually reverse that damage and make ourselves less susceptible to diseases like cancer?
That's what Seyfried thinks, yeah.
So it's not just about what we eat, it's about how those choices impact our whole metabolic state.
Right. And to help people figure that out, he actually developed something called the glucose ketone index.
The GKI. What's that?
It's this ratio that compares your blood glucose level to your blood ketone level.
Okay, and what does that tell you?
Well, it basically gives you a snapshot of your metabolic state, you know? It tells you whether your body's burning mostly glucose or ketones for fuel.
Okay.
The lower the GKI, the more you're in ketosis.
So if you're following a ketogenic diet, you want a low GKI
Exactly.
to show that your body's actually using those ketones.
Yeah, and it's a great way to track your progress and make adjustments to your diet if you need to.
I like that. It gives people more control, you know.
Yeah,
They can actually monitor their own metabolic health.
it puts them in the driver's seat.
Okay, so back to this press pulse strategy.
Oh, yeah. So we've got the press part. That's about cutting off the glucose. But then there's the pulse part.
And what's that?
Well, that involves using targeted therapies that, like, exploit the weaknesses of cancer cells.
Okay.
And the most promising one, according to Seyfried, is a drug called DAWN.
Dawn.
Yeah, it inhibits glutamine metabolism.
So we're cutting off the glucose with the press, and then we're hitting them with this Dawn drug to block their other main fuel source.
Yeah, it's like a 1-2 punch.
Mhm.
And this is actually where Seyfried gets frustrated with the current medical system because DAWN is not that easy to get for cancer treatment. He thinks it should be way more available.
It must be frustrating for him to see this potential treatment being held back, you know?
Yeah, for sure. But even without Dawn, there's some evidence that using a ketogenic diet alongside chemo can actually improve outcomes.
Really? How's that work?
Well, the idea is that the cancer cells are already weakened because they're not getting as much glucose, so the chemo doesn't have to be as strong.
So you can use lower doses of chemo, which means fewer side effects.
Exactly. It's a win-win.
Okay, so even if you're not ready to ditch conventional treatments altogether, incorporating a ketogenic diet could make those treatments more tolerable.
And potentially more effective.
So, okay, if we're cutting off the glucose, why is it so important to target glutamine too? Can't we just starve them with glucose restriction alone?
You see, cancer cells are tricky. They're really adaptable. They can evolve and find ways to survive even when things get tough. So if they're not getting enough glucose, they might start relying more heavily on glutamine.
Oh, so they're like switching fuel sources to stay alive.
Yeah, they're sneaky like that.
So is Dawn the only way to target glutamine?
Well, there are other drugs in development, but they're not as well studied, and there's some evidence that certain natural compounds might have some glutamine-inhibiting properties.
Like what?
Well, curcumin, for example. You know, the stuff in turmeric.
Right, right.
So there might be other options out there.
That's good to know. But I have to say, the whole idea of switching to a ketogenic diet, it sounds, I don't know, kind of overwhelming.
It's definitely a big change, and it's not for everyone,
Right.
but even small changes can make a difference.
Like what?
Well, cutting back on processed food, sugary drinks, those sorts of things.
Okay, so start small, make gradual changes that you can stick with.
Exactly. It's all about progress, not perfection.
And, as you start to see the benefits, maybe you'll be more motivated to make bigger changes.
Right. It's a journey.
So we've talked a lot about the science behind Seyfried's metabolic theory of cancer, the practical implications for diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
But the big question is this really the future of cancer treatment?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Is the medical community buying into this theory?
Well, it's complicated. There's definitely debate and resistance. As we were saying before, it's really hard to change deeply ingrained beliefs.
And Seyfried's been pretty outspoken, hasn't he? Criticizing the focus on genetic mutations.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't mince words. He's a controversial figure.
But that doesn't mean he's wrong.
Exactly. And the evidence for this metabolic theory, it's growing. More and more researchers are paying attention.
That's good to hear. It's not just him shouting into the void.
Not at all. And it's not just researchers either. There are doctors out there who are incorporating this approach into their practice and seeing positive results.
They are?
Yeah. We talked about Brad and Maggie Jones, remember? They're documenting stories of stage 4 cancer patients who've had success with metabolic therapy.
Wait, stage 4? That's usually, isn't that usually a terminal diagnosis?
Yeah, but these people, they're living longer and with a better quality of life than anyone expected.
So they're not being cured?
Well, Seyfried's careful about using the word cure. He talks about long-term management.
But still, that's incredibly hopeful, especially for people who've been told there's no hope.
It is.
But if he's right, this means we need to completely rethink how we approach cancer.
It's a paradigm shift. It's not just about finding a cure, it's about managing the disease.
And that requires a different mindset, both for patients and for doctors.
Exactly. It's about empowering patients and recognizing that there might be more than one way to treat cancer.
It's about expanding our options and looking beyond the traditional approaches. But man, it's a lot to process.
I know what you mean. It's a lot to take in.
We've gone from cancer is bad luck to maybe we have more control than we thought.
It's both exciting and a bit scary.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that's what makes this so important to talk about.
Yeah, platforms like this one, having these conversations, exploring these ideas.
It can help people make more informed decisions about their own health.
So what are your thoughts on the future of cancer treatment? Do you think this metabolic theory will eventually become like the standard of care?
It's hard to say. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done.
And a lot of minds to change.
Right. But I'm cautiously optimistic.
Me too, actually. The evidence is pretty compelling.
And the potential benefits are huge. We can't ignore that.
We might not have all the answers yet, but I think we're headed in the right direction.
I agree. We're starting to ask the right questions. We're exploring new possibilities. We're challenging the assumptions that have held us back for so long.
Yeah. It's an exciting time.
It is.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to digest today.
We have.
So before we wrap up, anything else you want to add?
Just this. Don't be afraid to question, to explore, to take control of your own health. Knowledge is power. And the more you understand about how your body works, the better equipped you are to make good decisions.
Great advice. We'll be back in a moment to wrap up this deep dive into the metabolic theory of cancer and explore what it all means for you, the listener. Don't go anywhere.
So where were we? Oh yeah, the press pulse strategy.
Right. That's Seyfried's approach to managing cancer. By targeting the fuel sources those cancer cells depend on.
Yep, and we talked about the press part, which is all about restricting glucose, kind of like cutting off the oxygen supply to a fire.
Right, starving those cancer cells.
Exactly. And the best way to do that, according to Seyfried, is through a ketogenic diet. Super low carbs, high fat, forcing the body to burn ketones for fuel.
Okay, so that's the press. What about the pulse?
Ah, the pulse part. This is where we get to use some more targeted therapies, really zero in on those cancer cells and exploit their weaknesses.
Okay, lay it on me. What kind of therapies are we talking about?
The most promising one, the one Seyfried really gets excited about, is a drug called DON, D-O-N.
DON, okay. What's so special about DON?
Well, it inhibits glutamine metabolism.
Ah, right, glutamine. We talked about that earlier. It's the other major fuel source for cancer cells besides glucose.
Exactly. So the idea is you cut off the glucose with the ketogenic diet, that's the press, and then you hit them with the DON to block their glutamine uptake, that's the pulse.
A 1-2 punch.
Boom, right on the money.
I like it.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier that Seyfried's kind of frustrated with the medical system because DON's not that easy to get for cancer treatment.
Yeah, he's definitely a bit outspoken about that. He thinks it should be way more accessible to patients.
I mean, I can see his point. If it's as effective as he claims, why wouldn't we want to make it more widely available?
Well, there are always a lot of factors involved, research protocols, approvals, all that stuff. But it's definitely a topic that deserves more attention.
Okay, so even if we can't get our hands on DON just yet, is there any evidence that using a ketogenic diet alongside conventional cancer treatments like chemo can be helpful?
Yeah, actually, there's some interesting studies coming out about that. The idea is that if the cancer cells are already kind of stressed out because they're not getting their usual dose of glucose, then the chemo might be more effective, and you might be able to use lower doses, which means, fewer side effects.
It's like a Jethro 1-2 punch.
Haha, I like that. Yeah, it's a way to potentially make those traditional treatments a little bit easier on the body.
So, okay, let's go back to glutamine for a second. If we're already cutting off the glucose, why is it so important to go after glutamine too? Can't we just starve those cancer cells with the glucose restriction alone?
Well, you see, cancer cells are pretty clever little buggers.
Oh.
They're very adaptable. They can actually evolve and find ways to survive, even in really harsh environments. So if they're not getting enough glucose, you know what they do.
What?
They start relying more heavily on glutamine.
So it's like they have a backup fuel source, they just switch over?
Yep, that's exactly it. They're like metabolic chameleons.
Sneaky little things. Okay, so DON might be the most effective way to target glutamine right now. But are there any other options? Anything else on the horizon?
Yeah, there are some other drugs in development, but they're not as far along as DON. But there's also some intriguing research on natural compounds that might be able to inhibit glutamine.
Natural compounds, like what?
Well, for example, there's curcumin, the stuff in turmeric. It's showing some promise.
Right, turmeric.
Yeah.
I put that in everything.
It does have some pretty amazing properties. So yeah, there might be some more natural approaches out there too. But it's early days,
More research needed, as always.
Okay.
Okay, well, I have to admit, the whole idea of switching to a ketogenic diet, it just sounds, I don't know, so restrictive. Is it really sustainable long term?
Yeah, it's a big change for most people. I get that. It's not something you just jump into overnight.
Right.
And it's not for everyone either. But the good news is even small changes can make a difference. You don't have to go full keto to start improving your metabolic health.
Okay, so baby steps. Where would you recommend people start?
Well, the biggest bang for your buck is cutting back on processed foods, sugary drinks, all that stuff that's basically metabolic sabotage in a package.
Right, ditch the junk.
Exactly. Focus on whole, unprocessed foods, lots of veggies, healthy fats, lean protein. It's all about giving your body the nutrients it needs to function properly.
Okay, so nourish those mitochondria, those little powerhouses.
They're the key to everything, really.
It's amazing to think that this whole conversation, this metabolic approach, it might be relevant for so many other health issues, not just cancer.
Oh, absolutely.
If this metabolic dysfunction is as widespread as Seyfried says it is, what other chronic diseases might be linked to it?
Well, that's a question that researchers are really starting to dig into. There's growing evidence that metabolic dysfunction plays a role in heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, even autoimmune disorders.
Wow, it's like this whole new way of understanding how disease develops in the body.
It's like we're peeling back the layers and seeing that so many of these chronic conditions might have a common root cause.
And if we can address that root cause, if we can improve metabolic health at a fundamental level, could that have implications for preventing or managing a whole range of diseases?
That's the hope. It's a paradigm shift, for sure.
A big one.
But like any major shift, there's going to be resistance, skepticism, even denial.
Right. People don't like to change their minds.
But the evidence is mounting, and the potential benefits are just too significant to ignore.
I'm feeling a mix of hope and, I gotta admit, a little bit of overwhelm.
Yeah.
It's a lot to take in.
I totally get it. It's a lot to process. But it's also incredibly empowering.
Empowering how?
Because it means we're not just passive victims of our genes or our circumstances.
Yeah.
We have choices. We have agency. We have the power to shape our own health destiny.
I love that.
Okay.
It's not about just giving people a list of rules to follow. It's about giving them the knowledge and the understanding so they can make informed choices for themselves.
That's it, exactly. It's about taking ownership of your health and recognizing that your body is incredibly resilient. It wants to heal. It wants to thrive. But we have to give it the right support.
Well said. We've definitely given our listeners a lot to think about today. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the metabolic theory of cancer, I want to leave you with this thought. What if this is just the beginning? What other secrets are our cells hiding, waiting for us to discover them? The journey to understanding our bodies is far from over. So keep asking questions, stay curious, and never stop exploring. Thanks for diving in with us.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Welcome back, deep divers.
Back for more metabolic madness.
Yeah. Well, we've been unpacking some pretty heavy science in this deep dive, exploring this whole idea that cancer, maybe it's not what we've always been told it is.
Yeah, it's a different way of looking at things, that's for sure.
Big time. So we've been talking about Professor Seyfried's metabolic theory of cancer.
Right. The theory that says cancer is actually a metabolic disease, not just a genetic one.
Yeah, and it all comes down to the little powerhouses in our cells, the mitochondria.
Those guys are at the heart of it all.
So let's bring it back to you, the listener. What does all this mean for your everyday life?
That's the big question, isn't it? We've thrown a lot of information at you, but knowledge, it's only powerful if you actually use it.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed. I mean, we've gone from cancer being this random thing, this bad luck thing, to something that maybe we have more control over than we thought.
That's a big shift, for sure.
Yeah, it's exciting, but also kind of scary. Like, where do you even start?
Well, I think the first step is just awareness, Start paying attention to how your body feels.
Like how it responds to the food you eat.
Yeah, exactly. And your activity levels, your stress levels.
So it's about tuning into those signals your body's sending you.
Exactly. Don't wait for a major health crisis to hit you over the head, Be proactive.
And if something feels off, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah. Talk to your doctor. Do your own research. Be your own advocate.
This whole deep dive has definitely made me realize how important it is to be an informed patient. Not just passively following orders, but really understanding what's going on.
Absolutely. It's your body. You're the one who has to live in it.
Right. So, okay, we've talked a lot about the ketogenic diet, which Seyfried sees as a really important part of his press pulse strategy for managing cancer.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big change for most people, though. Are there smaller steps people can take to start improving their metabolic health if they're not ready to go full keto?
Yeah, definitely. Just cutting back on the processed foods, the sugary drinks.
So those are like the biggest culprits.
Yeah, they're metabolic saboteurs. Focus on whole foods, real food, lots of veggies.
And healthy fats.
Oh, yeah, healthy fats are crucial. Olive oil, avocados, things like that.
Okay, got it. So it's all about giving your body those nutrients that it needs to function at its best. Yeah. And that supports those mitochondria.
That's the goal. Keep those little powerhouses humming along.
One thing that really blows my mind is this idea that this metabolic approach, it might go way beyond cancer.
Yeah.
If this dysfunction is as common as Seyfried thinks it is, what other chronic diseases could be connected to this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
There's some really exciting research happening right now looking at the role of metabolic dysfunction in all sorts of chronic diseases. Heart disease, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune disorders, you name it.
So it's like we're seeing this underlying pattern, this metabolic imbalance, that could be driving a whole bunch of different health problems.
It's like we're uncovering a whole new layer of understanding.
And if we can figure out how to address that, that could have huge implications for how we approach health and disease in general.
It's a total game changer.
It is. But man, it's a lot to think about. It can feel overwhelming, right?
I hear you. It is a lot. But it's also incredibly empowering.
Empowering how?
Because it means we're not just victims of our genes or our circumstances. We have choices. We have the power to make changes to improve our health.
It's about taking control of your own health destiny. I love that.
And it starts with understanding how your body works. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make those choices.
Well, we've certainly given our listeners a lot to chew on today, a lot to think about, a lot to explore.
We have. It's been a wild ride.
It has. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the metabolic theory of cancer, I want to leave you with this. What if this is just the tip of the iceberg? What other secrets are our cells whispering to us, waiting for us to uncover them? The journey to understanding our bodies and our health, it's never over. So keep asking questions, stay curious, and never stop exploring.
Thanks for diving in with us.
It's been a pleasure.
Wow.